please. As I mentioned, these are our presenters. I appreciate them at the semi-last minute coming and helping with these presentations for these three critical topics, and they'll do some brief introductions before each of their sections when we start in just a moment. Next slide. Now I'll turn it over to Nate and Rick. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jim. Good morning, everyone. As the screen tells you, I'm Nate Martinez-Wayman at Duke University, and I'm joined today by my co-chair of the working group, Mr. Rick Finger from the University of Washington. This is a topic, as Jim noted, that has come up before in FDP. As a little bit of context, the folks that we work with on this working group on the federal side are Mike Wetclow who's over the financial management branch. We're also working closely with Craig and Tammy at the Treasury as part of the Fiscal Innovation Team. That's what that FIT stands for. And they're really the workhorses and the drivers behind this idea in the first place. If for context, Mike tells this story much better than I can, but I know his role in this was inspired by one of our peers on the West Coast when he was talking to them at a site visit about the letter of credit process. And was convinced that there was a way to do something better in that space. And at the same time, Craig at the Treasury was exploring this idea of a distributed ledger technology. That's the DLT, often called blockchain, but the technical phrase is distributed ledger. So they ended up at Deloitte and exploring whether this was worth more discussion, engage stakeholders. That included FDP. They were here in January of 20 to talk about this project. They did end up developing a proof of concept model to kind of walk through how this future state could look. And then we determined to create a working group within the Finance Audit Costing Committee to really structure the feedback and to further engage with the Treasury and NSF to go through where they were in their process, what they were seeing as a potential pilot, and just kind of see how we could get all of our team members' expertise from across the university spectrum into this process. But before we go on, Rick, if you want to jump in and say a few things.
Sure. This work group was not established at the last meeting. So in January, we were just talking about the proof of concept, and the federal folks came in and gave us a bit of a presentation, and then we followed up with a special session where they took us through a little more detail and gave to us a clickable demonstration. And you can find that clickable demonstration at the Open Government Subcommittee website underneath the Research Administration group, if you're interested in kind of catching up with a little bit of what we're looking at. But the group since January has really been working hard to figure out what this prototype looks like, what it looks like to give solid feedback. So we're really pushing ourselves to figure out how best to roll up our opinions and engage our Fed partners and provide them the kind of feedback that they're looking for to ensure that a project like this lands in its best possible condition for all of us. So the working group is expansive. We've got quite a few folks, and they're a little bit different than the previous letter of credit working group that came out of Open Government, where we did a survey around the effort related to drawdowns. So we're getting a wide set of opinions and views, and it's really coming together. So this looks like a really good ongoing working group that was just not even started back in January and is now very much up and running.
Excellent. Next slide, please. So as Rick noted, through the OpenGov Research Admin Subcommittee, that we did a survey of members. That process first started in 2019. As with many things, it got sidetracked by COVID, but we're in the final stretch of creating the white paper, the written report that really dives into the details of what we were seeing, what all of us were reporting about the workload implications, the challenges of managing across the now 4 primary cash payment systems, how our financial systems interact with those in different ways, the reconciliation process. We really dove into a lot of the details of exactly what it takes on our side in order to fully participate. But I won't go into any further details now. This is a teaser so that you come to the research admin session tomorrow, and Rick will go through some of the results in more details. So next slide, please. Just another quick context setting. Another thing that has been happening all throughout the same time frame is the MITRE Research Group, and they were looking at it more broadly in terms of how a distributed ledger could be used across the grants management spectrum. So the work that we're talking about, both the letter of credit survey we did and what implications that has for payments, as well as this NSF Treasury pilot, that all fits into that centerpiece about the actual process payment. But the view that MITRE is taking is obviously much broader across the whole life cycle. Next slide, please. And this is just a little bit of a drill into how MITRE is seeing things in terms of where the distributed ledger could come into the process. The bit that's circled is all about the payments and the relationships between grantees and subrecipients and the grant making agencies. And that's the financial component. That's what our working group is really focused on. But just wanted to point out that at the same time, there's other work happening across other parts of the government and through MITRE that will get into how the auditors and are involved from the single audit perspective, from the inspector general perspective, how data is fed back out to the public through things like usaspending.gov. So it really is kind of in the midst of a broad review of how this technology could be used in different spaces. Next slide, please. But focusing on our working group and how this could impact the grants payment process and what improvements we could see there. The next few slides that we'll look at were developed by the Treasury team. Tammy has used them in discussions with our working groups. And I just wanted to highlight a few things in here about how they're seeing the current state and where the future state could go if this moves forward with a pilot. So this is showing the different actors involved, how the communication is flowing through the LOC, the letter of credit systems, and the gray there is a big hint into part of the drivers for this process. You know, it's tagged, I know it's a little hard to see, but it's tagged unknown subrecipients. And that is part of what's motivating the federal partners is to get better transparency into how the subrecipients are progressing financially and to be able to loop them directly into the flow and have a little more real-time awareness.
Yeah, and I would say related to the context of this slide, Nate, that the work group has spent some time getting their heads around the big picture and really what it looks like for the modernization piece, which is, you know, the DLT and the technology, and then really trying to ask ourselves what it looks like to put this up against our current activities and how it affects us day to day. So the group is now specifically honing in on the details around item number 2 there, and then its relationship to number 3. And then I think when we get to the advanced class, we'll be more towards 4. But it's been an interesting dialogue to go from, whoa, the whole modernization effort down to just trying to understand one little piece of the puzzle and then grow out from there. So good conversation all the way around.
Yes, yeah, it has been. The next slide, please. I am not intending to speak to the details of these next few slides by any stretch. I did want them in the slideshow, thinking that the folks that are interested enough in seeing more about this, you'll go out to the FDP site after the fact and download the slides. And then you can get a better sense of how the Treasury is viewing the current workflow and where the pain points are that are coming in. Next slide, please. That's the next few slides are looking at expressly at that. If this is happening in today's world in a particular part of the process, where could a distributed ledger solution make things better, both for the granting agencies and for us. There's a connection here to the LOC survey that we just talked through because they're acknowledging that one of the goals to improve things on our side administratively could be to have a single system, a single point of entry for requesting cash payments. And that would be obviously a significant savings and something that we're talking to them about just in terms of on the post award side, how much each of us are having to keep invested in the number of FTEs and person hours every year to manage the multiple systems. Next slide, please. Similarly here, there's other things that we're talking through of how could that pilot develop. There's potential gains with financial reporting happens between grantees and grantors. The returning of funds process, that's something that we've talked about as a committee since we started, and there's definitely different avenues available in this kind of a technology than what we're doing today. And also subrecipient payments, as we just pointed out, and that's also a great example of how the feedback exchange is going and how things are really complicated and can get complicated quickly. So as I mentioned, the funding agencies are looking for more transparent subrecipient spend that could be supported in a distributed ledger technology like this, where recipients could submit payment requests into the blockchain, into the system that still workflow through the grantee, through the pass-through entities. The financial transacting would be between the Treasury and the subrecipient directly. So that sounds promising. Could get out of the passing cash through to our subrecipients game, have a lot of savings on our AP activity. But as with everything that we talked through, it's quite complicated in reality. And those really the heart of the feedback is what are all the unintended consequences here for subrecipient payments expressly. The other side of the coin is how will this get handled in a single audit? How will we be able to recognize these payments to the subrecipients in order to report them in our CFA? How does it impact our total research portfolio reports, which obviously affects rankings among universities? And so the people who care about that broadens significantly. What are the legal implications on the federal side to be able to pay subrecipients directly instead of through the grantee? So that's only bringing it up here to give you a taste of the meat of our exchange sessions, that we're really getting great questions raised and getting the Treasury team to be aware of kind of the spider webs that come out of any one of these pain points. So next slide, please. Again, this is more for future ingestion if you want to download the slides and look at the details later. Next slide, please. This is just a retooling of, again, the Treasury's perspective on what the process could look like in a distributed ledger world and its impact on how each of the pain points would be potentially addressed and have potential admin savings for us. Next slide, please. So Rick noted earlier that they had created a clickable proof of concept model. That was the work that they did with Deloitte in particular. And I pulled this diagram from that model. I had to splice it a little bit since it doesn't fit onto a slide nicely. But in theory, that's all a workflow like that. But this image anyway resonates with me because of kind of its simplicity and its ability to walk somebody through what the process could look like if they're not already a letter of credit cash payment expert. That last icon in particular, I like thinking about when it's talking about the reporting on the end-to-end life cycle. That's something that we don't, as that letter of credit survey told us, we all spend a lot of time in the reconciliation process of trying to get our financial systems aligned with each of the payment systems. And the ability to have the one system and it to be completely based on data come out of our financial systems. Obviously, any potential data integration between our financial systems and something like this would be a huge lift, technologically speaking, OIT resources, et cetera. But I think the potential savings are just as huge for us. Next slide, please. And of course, wanted to point out, these are all of the good folks that we would not be here without. They have volunteered for the cause. They are being very generous with their time and their expertise and their feedback. We're trying to meet with the NSF Treasury team about once a month point, and we generally have interim meetings and discussions between there. But the level of engagement and the depth of the feedback has been fantastic, and that's exactly what we as a working group are about. How can we get the grants payment process better than it is today? So we'll keep coming back to this committee in future meetings. We'll keep everyone updated on kind of where that Treasury team is going, how the feedback is turning out, what their plans for a pilot are looking like. If there's any questions you have along the way, anything that you want to get considered if possible, you can of course always reach out to Rick directly, to me directly. If you're already close colleagues with any of these folks, of course you can reach out to them as well. But that is our update for today. Rick, turn over to you for comments, open it up for questions. If people have things they want to throw in the chat, if you want to raise your hand for questions, we can do a little bit of that now before moving on to Tim and Sheila.
Yeah, I'll just second your gratitude towards the work group participation and the time dedicated and really trying to forge a two-way street that goes beyond just raw feedback and gets into that partnership kind of feel as we try to help some of these modernization efforts. And then I don't see really any questions coming our way. I answered the one around where the clickable is, and that's out on the Open Government website. If you just scroll down the page, you'll see the link and the password to get into the link.
Yeah, and just a quick note, if you're new to that, it is literally a clickable demo. So for that page, it will guide you where on the page to click to advance through what the process could look like. But if you haven't done that process before, it's not immediately intuitive.
Thanks, guys. This is great. Really appreciate it, keeping us in the loop.
We have one question, Jim, before I
you do.
turn
Yeah,
it on
please,
from
please.
Melissa. Excellent question. Do you think something like this could work with all subrecipients or only domestic? That is exactly a topic that has come up already, because I know that the Treasury team is exploring ways to build a pilot around existing platforms, which everyone is moving toward login.gov as an authentication method for entry into their particular portal. So the Treasury team is looking at that as well, what this pilot could be. And that does bring up questions of, does everybody have equal access into login.gov, and what are their implications for our foreign subrecipients, and would they be able to fully participate? So that's one of the topics that we're working through in this pre-pilot phase. That's an excellent question. Okay, but we'll be here obviously the whole time. We can take more questions at the end. But in the absence of more right now, I'm happy to turn it over to Tim and Sheila. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Nate. I'm Tim Reuter. I'm Senior Director of Post-Award Operations at Stanford. Sheila, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Sheila Doyle, Portfolio Team Manager in the Central OSP office at Harvard in the Research Finance area.
Great. Okay. As Jim stated early on, these are some of the next slide you can go to. I've already presented several of these slides back in January, so I'll go through this very quickly. As we all know, these slides and the recording will be out there. So if you need to go back and refer to any of this, it's there. A lot of this is off the Treasury website, kind of talk about what it is. So quickly, for those that may not know or want to live through the pain one more time, Treasury offset is where your institution has received an invoice or some sort of bill from a federal agency and you haven't paid it. The federal agency reports it to the Treasury, and the Treasury offsets or takes away the money from the payment to you. This is called a Treasury Offset Program, TOP. And to give you an idea of how much they've recovered, just in fiscal year 2020, they recovered $10.4 billion. So a fairly significant amount of money. Next slide. So here's the website you can go to get more information on what they do. This is a law. It's not like a regulation under Treasury or anything. This is a law that's been put out there. So we're very clear that, you know, hey, we're not going to be able to snap our fingers and change anything. But, you know, the law states that any debt that's 120 days overdue, may not be all federal debt, but much of it, that when the agency puts in the request to the Treasury to offset or to pay us, they will go out and check this website to see if anybody has submitted an overdue payment from your institution. They will look it up based upon your institution's taxpayer identification number, and that's where they will match it up, and they will offset or not pay you the full amount of the invoice that you're expecting to get paid. Next slide. So, you know, this is, again, they're just matching up payments, doing it by taxpayer identification number. And it's just, you know, so it's very rarely the same invoice or same agency that you're dealing with. A lot of mine, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, are about the Veterans Administration one that I deal with. We hire some of their faculty, clinical and research faculty over into Stanford. They're kind of very close to us, and they work with us. And yet we also have other, you know, where they hire ours, but it could be a payment that's due to us from Air Force, you know, some DOD agency or any agency really. And the VA has put an invoice out there and claimed that we owe debt to the federal government, and therefore they will just take our money and pay the VA, and we're left standing there with not having the full payment on our award. Next slide. This is just a quick graph of what it looks like, you know, and kind of how it works, obviously. Next slide. This is the letter that you will get. This is an old letter. Most of it is pretty similar to any of the current letters that come out. I split it in half on 2 slides just so it would be readable. You know, it you know, clearly tells you it's not a bill, and that's because they've already taken the money. You know, who, and then they write in here in the middle here, you'll see Palo Alto VA Medical Center. This is who they took the money for to pay. They tell me, Father, that the purpose of it is a non-tax federal debt. You know, the taxpayer identification number up here, this is Stanford's taxpayer identification number that they let me know. And the amount that they credited here was the 69. Excuse me, next slide. So the bottom half of the letter, it has some more real meat to it, but the couple of interesting comments in here. Just the first line, the agency has previously sent this notice to you at the last address known to the agency, which, wow, that's great. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then here in red, you can see an underline. If you believe the payment was reduced in error, you may have questions about the debt. You can contact the agency at the address and telephone number shown above. But the U.S. Department of Treasury Bureau of Fiscal Service cannot resolve issues regarding debts with other agencies. They can't tell you the invoice. They can't tell you any information. All they can do is, hopefully, if you get to somebody, they might be able to send you a copy of the letter that was sent to your institution. You can go on down farther and you can see there the payment summary. Again, back in 2016, they used to pay us everything but $1. So here you can see the payment before the reduction was that we requested was $6,985. They paid me $6,984. And so it was $1. And that was kind of a nice thing to see, at least if you saw a payment come across at $1, that was kind of a highlight to you that you knew that, hey, wait a minute, something probably got offset. I don't think they're doing that anymore, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now they just take the whole thing, and unless you're really lucky and you get a copy of the letter from somebody, you start calling these agencies asking for the payment, and they say they paid you. Next slide. So once you get the letter, now the fun really begins for you. Because while you might know, and I'll talk about mine as the example from the VA. I don't know what invoice was unpaid, what individual department at my institution or whatever it was that got the original invoice. Since they send the letter to the same person, same address that the unpaid invoice was sent to, that's really not a very big help, because if that same person ignored the original invoice, more than likely they'll ignore this one. And in my experience, several of them have been sent to a person that's either out on maternity leave or has left the institution, and nobody updated the address for the VA to send their invoice to. So I'm kind of stuck there for several months before anybody even realizes what went on. The offset will never equal the unpaid invoice amount, or it never has for me in the 30 years I've been doing this. It might cover all or just a portion of the payment. Therefore, it makes reconciliation incredibly difficult. Next slide. Just a quick example of kind of how it comes through. Hey, this was a invoice that we sent to the VA, $25,000. A couple of offsets were applied to it. My example here, the 6984 was taken. Then we had another 18,201 of that invoice was left out of a payment from AFOSR for 20,000. So all of a sudden I received a payment from OSR for $1,798.32 when I was expecting 25. Next slide. Okay, so again, the VA cannot tell me what invoice was sent to the top offset. They state their system automatically identifies debt due over 120 days and send it to the top offset. If the department would happen to pay that outstanding invoice in between the time that the VA has sent the invoice to top offset, then basically they can't pull it back, the VA. So now the VA has been paid twice, both by your institution and by the Treasury offsetting one of your other payments. I've been told by the VA they don't like to issue refunds. It creates a lot of work for them. I will withhold any other comment on that. But again, if they've received duplicate payment, what the VA is doing to me is they are taking that payment and just applying that to another open standard invoice. So now I've lost the connection between the original unpaid invoice and where the top offset was applied, or where that payment that came in after they did the top offset was applied. And now you're really in a pickle because you got multiple invoices that are impacted by just one payment. Next slide, please. So one other thing, and I'll let Sheila, I'll let you take the lead here on this one, of what else can happen to us when they do this.
Yeah, so the places that we've noticed at Harvard that are most likely impacted by these missing payments are my office, the sponsored office, and I first started noticing these happening when I was the cash manager. So my team was doing letter of credit draws and checks and wire payments on sponsored, and we were being debited by the government on usually our DHHS draws. And I didn't really understand why at the time, about 7 years ago. In doing a lot of research since, it seems like it's usually our sponsored payments or our student financial services office, where I think they're receiving financial aid payments in from the government for students that are being debited. And so what we've seen twice since I've been in OSP anyway, is if this isn't resolved and they're not able to debit us, then they may place our institution in a status called delinquent on federal debt. And if we're in that status, we can not draw any funds by letter of credit. We will not receive any payments from the government. But in addition, and perhaps more frightening, we also cannot receive any new obligations on any grants or contracts from the government. Luckily, that's usually been resolved within a day or so, because we can usually show that we have in fact been debited by TOP. already. And so then they remove the delinquent on federal debt status. But that's a little bit scary.
Yeah, so I had the exact same instance last summer. I had, luckily I'd been working very recently with the VA, and we had a Department of Defense contract that was held up, and they stated I had delinquent debt and therefore they could not issue it to me. I tried sending them the top offset letter. That didn't do anything. I had to get my contact at the VA to contact the person, both at the agency and to go through the Treasury to acknowledge that, yes, they had taken that debt and did it. So where Sheila was real lucky, maybe she's just better than I am, she was able to get it done in a day or two. It took me several days to get all the people lined up to be able to have the agency allow us to receive that new award. So
it wasn't me, to be fair. It was Webb Brightwell at our institution who was each time able to do that.
Great.
But Tim and Sheila, so you're saying,
go ahead.
You're saying that you were in a position where the federal government thought you were delinquent on something and you were hours or days away from them holding awards.
That's correct.
In our cases, they had already stated that they are now holding awards. And my understanding from Webb is that they marked us as such in SAM, I think. And so other institutions, I think, were starting to call us and say, what's going on with you being delinquent on federal debt? Now, they had already debited us through TOP. So we weren't delinquent, but the systems weren't like syncing up and stuff. So it looked to them like we were delinquent, I guess. In one instance, I believe it was like a $200 bill.
Yeah, $1 million contracts for a $200 bill. Yeah, always fun. A couple of quick comments in here in the chat. Somebody was asking, is it just could it be an LLC draw that they're going to offset the money from, or is it always some other payment that they're going to be making, like for an IPA or whatever? It varies. I've had it go against normal individual payments from agencies that they either going to be sending me an individual credit, or it is I have had a situation where they took a whole lot of money from a letter of credit draw from NIH that they just offset, a bunch of awards for like $1.2 million or whatever.
And we've had multiple different debits. And like I said, most often there are sponsored payments or the student financial group is seeing them. But then it gets real confusing when it's a different group, like someone who had sent an invoice for an IPA or some other non-sponsored reason that's just a department. And they think they're supposed to be getting paid, but their entire payment was debited before they got it. And it's really, obviously difficult to explain to them how this works and why that happened and why they have to wait to get their money.
Next slide. There is a question out there from, is VA the primary group using or creating these issues? For me, I guess it probably is, but as we get into this, Sheila will talk a little bit more about issues she's having with HHS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Again, this is federal law, so I'm not envisioning really that, I'm going to be able to go and, stand on the Senate floor or something to get anything to happen. This is going to take a long time for anything to change. And we understand that. I accept that. That's fine. But our goal is to get a better understanding of the size of the problem. How many other agencies are we dealing with? We want to inform institutions that may be unaware of this happening and what to look for. We're also looking for improvements at an individual institution level. That's where mostly it's going to happen, reaching out to agencies individually. I've done a lot of outreach to our local VA and I'm getting some help, but not much. And then, again, our hope is to get a contact to Treasury. Sheila's had some help with that, and to try to help them continue to understand our frustration in the amount of work created. Next slide. So again, what we'd really like to do is find out from some of you, and again, you're putting things in chat, and that's great. Who have we experienced these, what agencies have been dealing with? Veterans Administration for me, IPAs, courses taken by veterans at your institution, IRS unpaid or disputed taxes, and DHHS, as I said, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That is additionally complicated by the fact that this might be payments for patients or whatever. And
Yeah,
therefore,
so a lot of
HIPAA
our
rules.
recent, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
A lot of our recent ones have been Medicare, and obviously with, patient information, it's completely confidential. So, which I'm glad about, obviously, but that just makes it one step more difficult for us to get any information about how to resolve it. So luckily we have a good group in our benefits services group who is working directly with Medicare to try to resolve some of this. But it's already a little bit tough to get some information from, when you call some of the numbers on these letters you get, and people aren't familiar with TOP at the number that you're calling, so they can't really help you with any further information. But then when it's patient privacy, of course, it makes it even that much little bit more difficult.
And that always adds additional frustration to your staff when they call an agency and they don't even have a clue about top offset, much less what invoice or what other issue you're dealing with. So very, very frustrating. But again, some of them have come through on the chat. Please give us, other agencies or ones that you've dealt with. And then when you're doing that, please also let us know, hey, we're dealing with this agency, but they've been helpful, or no, these guys are just as unhelpful as it sounds like Tim is experienced with the VA. So we certainly.
Mario mentioned in the chat getting a monthly report from G2G, which is what we're now getting also, which is helpful, although a lot of the times it just says who was expecting the credit. It just says President and Fellows of Harvard College and our legal address. So it doesn't really tell us who might be missing money.
So Tim,
go ahead. Yes.
So Tim, if I could just ask the group a question as you continue through. So it looks like if it's VA and HHS, it's probably mostly around academic medical centers that have affiliated. Is that a true statement? I'm curious if others are seeing it outside of that arena.
Mine are not. We don't have a hospital that is part of Harvard. We have affiliated hospitals. Ours tend to be, veterans who are taking classes at one of our schools, but then drop out. So there's an appropriate amount, or it could be like a workers' comp claim, some sort of health insurance issue, either for an employee or one of their family members, something like that.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Good question, Jim. Okay, next slide. So again, I think some recent changes that I'm seeing here in the last year or so, they don't seem to be withholding or paying us just the $1 amount. So again, I don't have any clue that when the payment, I don't receive at all, that I got to go to the agency. If I don't get the letter, that I got to go to the agency and ask why. And then they'll go through their payment system and find out, hey, wait a minute, we sent the payment on, and in their books, they fully paid us. It's just that on my books, I don't have the receipt of the money, and now I can't close out an award. I can't move forward. I can't do anything until I figure out where to charge, what department or area within the institution to go get my money from. Again, somebody mentioned this, and Sheila just mentioned this, that they were able to go out and get a copy of a report, this G2G at fiscaltreasury.gov, some sort of monthly offsets. They were able to get this listing from the Treasury. So that might be something that's out there. We will make sure that email address gets out there for you to institutions to request from the Treasury. That would be very helpful. Sheila, do you want to talk about this middle point here about, I didn't even understand, I've never seen this at all, 18-day work period or whatever. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so they send, my more recent understanding is that they send a demand letter to whoever they're trying to collect the debt from. So one of our schools, let's say, which sometimes we get a copy of if the school sends it to us, but we never get a copy from the government of that. But in this one instance, the demand letter was telling them, I believe, that they had 18 days to work with them to resolve it before they're going to offset our next credit. My sense is if the school or whoever doesn't respond within those 18 days, then they'll just simply debit us, which is at least better than before, where from my point of view, they were just debiting us and no one was getting any letters. But apparently they are sending these letters to, like you said, the last known address, which is not my office usually.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that I deal with too, is that I don't know who at the VA I'm dealing with, and they don't know what invoice or whatever. There's, I don't know, 10 or 12 different areas within the Palo Alto VA that I'm trying to get this information from and trying to get an understanding of whose invoice it was or whatever. The VA, again, not totally the VA's fault. They will send the original invoice, then they'll send 2 follow-up invoices to my institution. And if those aren't paid, once it gets to that third month out, 120 days old, then they're going to pass that on. As they tell me, it automatically gets pulled out of their system and sent on to the Treasury Offset program. So, you know, it's not that it's all 100% the VA's problem. You know, it's certainly my departments that aren't paying their invoices. But boy, once it gets into that top offset situation, you are in for a lot of fun. Next slide. So certainly what we would like agencies to be able to do, and again, acknowledging any of these changes may not come anytime soon, it would be great if the agency could really provide the unpaid invoice to top or if they're sending that invoice to top, they should be required to send a copy of that invoice to a central office or receivables office at your institution, as opposed to just that department or area that already ignored the original invoice.
There's usually some group at your institution that's going to be extremely interested in resolving this, like whoever was supposed to get a payment, but they got debited before it got to them, like your sponsored office, cash team, or possibly your student financial group.
Yeah, and we're, as we all know, we're the ones that we request payments all the time in the sponsored area. So we're more than likely the ones that they're going to take the money from. So it's going to impact us tremendously. Certainly, I think if there's any kind of duplicate payment issue going on, it would certainly be nice if they were to not apply it to some other open invoice, but at least let us know, give us some advance notice of where they're going to put that double payment they receive. And then it would be great if the agencies had one office that had the information pertaining to all these invoices sent to the top offset. So that would be extremely helpful if we could ever get that in. Next slide. Again, love if we could get the Treasury to maybe make a few changes and send a duplicate letter, not just to the department that or whatever that the original invoice was sent to, but if it could go to an institutional central office so we could collect those and see those and find those and know how to follow up on them. Obviously, timing's the biggest thing here. If we can catch something right away, it's a lot easier to go to somebody and say, hey, did you just send an invoice out? Or, you know, are you expecting something? Or do you just get an invoice from whoever for $25,000 that didn't get paid? And they might have a better idea of remembering that. Then sometimes I'm 6 months or longer trying to get a copy of the letter. And, you know, it's out of sight, out of mind for whoever. And then trying to run those down is extremely difficult. It'd be great if they could send those letters to us via email and not USPS. Again, more timely investigation. It'd even be better if they could establish a website that we could just go out and get copies. They would just put them out there and we could go get them. But also looking for any other suggestions that you might have. Anybody, if you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. So we have some sent initial request to college and university request at fiscaltreasury.gov and work with somebody there. Student financial aid services, they say they have some individuals that are dealing with some issues. Suggesting that we go to sam.gov could be a source for identifying some information. So suggestions that we will be happy to follow up with. Any other comments or questions or anything else that we could offer up to anybody? Again, mostly not great, but you know, maybe misery loves company. Maybe that's what the name of my presentation should be. Let's tangentially related question for those universities who are part of a statewide system. Do you all share a taxpayer identification number or employer identification number? Great question. And this was something I did. I'll just give you a quick note on this one. Years ago at a previous institution, the hospital used to be a part of our institution. back in the 90s when the hospitals, got away from the institution and joined, consortiums or bigger hospital groups, our hospital was no longer part of our institution, but then we started getting top offsets because their original invoices into the VA were under the taxpayer identification number when they were part of the university. So what happened was after they were gone, 3 or 4 years after they were gone, now I had to go back to them and say, hey, I need you to pay me because they've gone back 4 years ago and found out that they double paid invoices to you at your institution. So again, great help for all those kind of things. Great, some really good comment. Any other comments or suggestions? Any hands raised? Anybody have anything else they want to bring up?
Tim, just a question. I wonder if this is right for a brief survey, right? Because in the preparatory discussions we've had, these are generally small in number. They can vary in size, but they're all disproportionate to the burden and the grief that it causes. And this idea that a $200 charge, could put you in a situation where you're delinquent is crazy.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
we can take that. We can take that offline. But if people
Okay.
have thoughts on that, if they want to be part of that discussion, let Tim know, and we can kind of take it offline and have more discussion.
Great.
And my question in the chat was, so the student financial aid offices are having these exact same issues, same thing? Sometimes
Yes.
they go financial aid and they do it to financial aid. Sometimes they do it on the research side. Random, no
sometimes
idea
on
why.
other sides, other groups, but those are like small invoices that they don't know what's happening when they're getting debited. But we're drawing
Okay.
from HHS every Monday, so that's like an easy target. And my
Got
sense is maybe the student financial also is getting regular funding in.
Okay.
Great.
Next slide, just real quick. Again, any suggestions or comments? Appreciate all the comments in the chat. We will get copies of those and try to follow up with any of you if there's something else we can do with this. As usual, we've got a lot of people saying they share our pain. Any words of wisdom you can pass on to us or other positive experiences you might have had. And then the last slide is just Sheila and my email address. In case you want to reach out to us individually, we'd be more than happy to talk with you. So again, I've seen, let's see, we had this happen in the VA. Yeah. So it's just mostly everybody saying they're dealing with those same kind of issues across either University of Colorado shares a statewide employer identification number for 4 campuses. Each has their own DUNS, but if they're doing it by employer identification number, then wow, you won't even know what university it is where the original invoice was. So yeah, there's issues out there for all of us, which is why I'm bringing it up, because something needs to happen. We need to try to get somebody that at least acknowledge what's going on and see what we can do. So that's why we're out here pushing it. That's all I got, Jim.
Great.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. That was wonderful. Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Tim. Great. Next slide. So I'm going to pause on this very briefly. We've had various discussions about public data access and related. Today, what Melissa and I wanted to talk about was the costing perspective. Melissa, I think Melissa's still on. Melissa, if you can introduce yourself and your committee work that you do related to public data access, that'd be great before we get into costing specific discussions.
Hi, yeah, I'm Melissa Korf. I'm the Director for Grants and Contracts at Harvard Medical School. And I'm also still relatively new in the co-chair role for the Research Compliance Committee. But up until I moved into that role, I was created and co-chaired the Data Stewardship Subcommittee. And we focused on, our primary project, which was a collaboration with the Contracts Subcommittee to develop a template data transfer and use agreement, but also on a wide variety of other issues related to, data management best practices, streamlining with agencies. We've had some presentations from the STRIDES initiative, as well as Susan Gregorick, who's in I think the relatively new Associate Director for Data-Driven Finance at NIH. And, one of the major challenges with implementing best practices is the cost. Everyone wants to do the right thing. They want to collect their data, you know, in a really thoughtful way. They want to store it. They want to share it. But how do we pay for it, right? And so it could be one of the major stumbling blocks to growth in this space.
Thanks, Melissa. That's great. Next slide. So Melissa and I have 3 high-level setup slides that we're not going to go into detail, and then we have a couple of more that we want to discuss. This is here more for posterity. Is from an NIH perspective, everybody's probably familiar with this, but public access started decades ago. The discussions, it was kind of kickstarted yet again with the 2013 Holdren memo that talks specifically about various aspects of public data. Of note for today's discussion is that middle notice, the 21-015, that specifically talks about reasonable and allowable costs related to curating data, local data management considerations, and preserving and sharing data through established repositories. So we're going to touch on that and a bit more, but I would imagine that most that need to be familiar with these notices are familiar with them at a minimum. Next slide. And again, Melissa reminded me that we should include this. This has been noted in a couple of places here at FDP, at Koger, and elsewhere. I think, Melissa, it was released a month or 2 ago, recently. Is that right?
Yes, still a very recent. I think the date on it might be 2020, but it was published finally just a few months ago.
Yeah, great. So it's a very detailed report. Probably many of our faculty member as well that are on this call participated in this, as well as many other entities were involved in this report. Melissa and I and others are still processing it, but there's a lot of good information in there. Very detailed, very focused on biomedical data, as the title suggests. Next slide. And then I wanted to point this out. AAU, APLU has been working with this, what they refer to as APARD, which is Accelerating Public Access to Research Data. The link is up there at the top. They recently released the report Guide to Accelerate Public Access to Research Data. The link is at the bottom. Great report, lots of perspective on issues related to public access, of which costing is just one piece. And again, some of your institutions have been invited to a number of different meetings and discussions hosted by AAU and APLU, but funded by NSF and I think by NIH as well, but primarily NSF. So both of these are great links, as well as that prior document. And we'll be talking about elements of that and other things that were mentioned in these reports. Next slide. So I apologize for the small print on this one. What I'm going to do is hit the highlights on this, dig in deep, and then come back out to this high-level review. But this is a spreadsheet that was created out of some of the APARD discussions. Again, that's Accelerating Public Access to Research Data discussions, of which costing is just one small piece. And again, we're going to come back to this one, but next slide. The columns, just so you can read them easier, are here, right? So initially, this was a kind of a unidimensional spreadsheet. And over the last couple of months, we've made it clearer. So the columns going across are activity, timing, and what the sponsor might pay. Activity being, what is it that we're talking about related to public data access? The timing is, does that occur pre-award, during the life, or post-award? And then from a funding or a payment standpoint, are these things that the sponsor might pay directly? Are they things that the institution might pay, and they may or may not be capped in the F&A rate? Are they things where if they're data, they might be an external data repository? And I would imagine Melissa will comment on that more. Or are they things that are in storage somewhere, but we might charge a user to access, which again is contrary to what public access is all about, but in some cases an option. Next slide. So they were the columns and here are the rows. And then we're going to jump back out to that first spreadsheet. So the rows from an activity standpoint are essentially numbered 1 to 11. We tried to do this somewhat in sequential order, that when you're thinking about public access, it often starts with the data management plan, and that happens generally pre-proposal. And then there's things related to data curation and data dictionary and so forth. And then you ingest the data and then you monitor for compliance. And then in line 5, you store the data during the life of the award. And then you transition to moving towards post-closeout. Some of it may have publication, may be in line with the publication. And then continuing on, there's monitoring and compliance post-closeout. There's data storage post-closeout. In some cases, there might be cold data storage, which is, you know, longer term, cheaper storage, but not as accessible. There may be publication fees in line 10, and then there's a whole host of things related to data security and other things that we're going to talk about. Next slide. And so I'll pause there, Melissa. What did I miss? Because now what we want to do is kind of hang out on this slide and talk through various things, like when we talk about cost of public access, and Melissa and I are talking about it, is Melissa talking about line 3 data ingest and I'm talking about line 8 data storage, and we're not even talking about the same thing. And so that's, again, kind of what we were trying to do with this one pager. But Melissa, I'll pause and let you color commentary.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And this is a really excellent spreadsheet, I think, in terms of looking at the full life cycle. I think a lot of institutions and a lot of researchers have struggled to try to figure out the full cost of data management and sharing. And, you know, we have some examples of tools that have been put out there. You know, one example is a cost estimator tool that was published by the National Institute of Mental Health when they published their data sharing policy, where they require human subject data to be deposited into their repository. But their tool only focuses on a very small piece of the cost. It focuses on the cost to, you know, clean the data, upload the data, but there's a lot of effort that's put in on the NIMH repository end of things. There's a lot of effort that goes into planning, storing the data locally at the institution, and things like that just aren't accounted for. And so taking this life cycle approach really helps us identify where we might be missing things. I also think, you know, willingness of the sponsor to pay is a big thing for us to consider, whether that's the right approach or how to approach that, right? This makes it really clear that there are a lot of costs here. And when we're looking at NIH awards in specific, because I think that's the policy that we're all struggling with implementation, you know, coming at us in January 2023. You know, caps on those awards haven't increased in a really long time. And so to say to a researcher, you're already feeling strapped to do your research within the caps that you're presented with or within the amount that you can get in your grant, also budget in some direct costs to cover your data management and sharing costs. You know, that's really difficult. In addition to the burden that some of them may be feeling in trying to, you know, figure out how to comply with some of these new requirements. In some cases, there is an external repository, in which case we may be able to very well define, as in the NIMH case, what the direct cost might be to actually store the data in that system. And there might be a lot of data standards and a lot of work already done. But the NIMH or the NIH policy is very broad to accommodate for, you know, all types of research, and there may not be an external repository that exists. So our are institutions having to stand up their own general data repositories? Could you put it in cold data storage? Or do you have to leave it in your more expensive sort of live data storage so that you can produce it rapidly if requested? I also think there's a lot of both administrative burden potentially and cost associated with data deposit agreements if you're dealing with an external repository. Someone needs to review that. Someone needs to sign up for the institution because many institutions assert ownership over the data. Then the more data that's available, the more data use agreements people are needing to sign in order to gain access to certain data sets. But I think that this is a really great start at taking a comprehensive look at this problem that is a really tough nut to crack.
Thanks, Melissa. While people are thinking about comments or questions, because we are hoping to generate some discussion, just a couple of additional points. We've had some very, very preliminary conversations with Michelle about this. And years ago in conversations with NIH, I don't think it was Michelle at the time, but there was full acknowledgement, and I think it was a little bit described in one meeting that we were all admiring the problem, right? That this is a massive situation, both a cultural change of how institutions support their faculty and faculty manage their data and make it available, and the potential cost implications. There's lots of examples where it's one thing if it's a flat data set that you have to make publicly available. It's another thing whether it's a petabyte, lots of petabytes of information for image data that could cost $50 or $100 or $200,000 a year to make it available, and that could easily happen. The second thing I wanted to mention is in conversations that Koger has had with Carrie Wollenitz and others, and I think even on Carrie's website, on her blog, where she announced the NIH notices, she emphasized what a massive cultural shift this was for the faculty as to how they think about how critical data is. That the research is wonderful, but having it memorialized and available in the data to build upon and support the research is what's critical. And I think actually, for those of you that listened to the conversation on Monday, Dr. Gita Swami, who's from Duke, she was one of the presenters along with others, she mentioned that. And that's something at Duke that she and many others are spending a lot of time and energy on, making sure that there's full awareness about the importance of the data, not only as a compliance aspect, but as a criticality of the research. So do we have any, I posted a question, how are people dealing with this? Are people worried about this? Are they, from an NIH perspective, is the date so far out that it's something to think about, but it's not worrying you too much? We were hoping to kind of generate some discussion on this document.
I wonder too, Jim, to just ask a little bit more specific question, what folks would think about the idea of a separate award, right? So as a way to kind of deal with the cap issue and the desire not to take away direct costs needed to actually do the research to support the data management and sharing, either a separate award that might be made to maintain the data after the initial research award ends, or potentially an infrastructure award to the institution, where Phil Bourne, who was the associate director for data-driven science at NIH, maybe 5 or so years ago, had pitched this idea of credits, where instead of asking for funds to purchase a server, or I guess nowadays funds to cover cloud compute costs, you would get credits for what he called a commons compliance system to store your data in, and leveraging a model like that when we're submitting grants, we could say, like, this is this is X units of data that are needed here for this project. And that money could get to the institution via a separate mechanism. Because I think one of the other issues is this sort of, from a costing perspective, the funds turn off, somewhere at that end of the life, right before the post begins. The ability to charge on the individual award itself ends, but the data keeps going. And so how do we both support the cost without compromising the funding that's available for research, and also make sure that an institution has the cost that it needs to maintain that data after the life of the award?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's kind of what the fourth column over, that separate award with a different period of performance. And the idea would be I submit my data management plan and I'm awarded the grant to actually fund the research that I'm going to do. But as part of the data management plan, I've agreed to keep certain data available for a certain amount of time. And there would be a separate award with a separate period of performance that would make it that would essentially pay for the storage of that data. That's kind of the idea. I do see that we're seeing some questions in the chat. So one of the questions I think was, couldn't you use the uncapped F&A? Yeah, I think so. But I mean, part of the issue there is, and that's one of the columns I have there. I think I have it labeled. Institution pays, but it's in the uncapped, either the O&M or the library component. And because those are the two components that are uncapped. As we all know, the way the negotiation works, that may or may not be an achievable way to fund it. That certainly is one option. We are actually the very first item on this chart, the data management plan development. We actually, the library is where we fund some of the data management plan experts and individuals that can assist the faculty throughout the institution. And so it is in our uncapped library pool, and technically it is in a place that we could recover it. Now, whether that will happen or not through the negotiations is a different thing, but yes, that's absolutely one of the options. Yeah, and so one of the other questions was the institution pay columns. Your comment is a good one. This entire spreadsheet is meant to be provocative and thought-provoking, so we can think through different things. A service center could be stood up that is to help with the curation, to help with the data ingest, to help with the compliance, the data management and compliance during the life of the award. And that could be in the budget and could be charged as a direct charge in some cases if the sponsor allows it. But I agree, it takes up a lot of work to stand up a service center. But our situation, at least at Duke, is if you slide it over the next column where it's in the capped component, if it's in the uncapped component, we may or may not be able to collect it. If it's in the capped component, we're many, many points over the cap. So all of that is absolutely unrecoverable costs.
I think it would also be interesting in that same vein, Jim, to think about what of these could be generalized to the extent that you could provide an institutional service center to cover. So like one of the things I'm thinking about is a data management plan. You might be able to provide general resources, general guidance. You should think about these things. But they're often so tailored, so specific to the individual field, to the individual project, in order to really meet the needs of the very specific data that's being collected. I wonder, in the same way that NIH struggled to really write a very specific policy that covered all the various types of research that they fund, you know, what of these things are so specific to the research that it would be really hard for the institution to set up a service center to facilitate that work. I mean, I think it could really work for something like data storage, but you know, the fundamentals of data curation, but the actual, you know, cleaning of the data, prepping it probably really needs to be done by someone with expertise.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And maybe, Melissa, we can talk with Michelle at a future date about having a faculty-centric discussion on this, because I'd love to hear their thoughts. I mean, you know, as always, our concern is whether it's project management or clerical admin or tracking, you know, samples or anything else, we'd much rather have our faculty doing the hard science as opposed to doing some of the administrative and compliance activities. And if we as administrators and compliance professionals or technical experts could do that, it makes much more sense across the board. And you're right. Then the issue is, will the sponsor fund those activities? Can we do it consistently? Are our faculty open to doing it that way, and so forth?
I see that we have one other comment in the chat about potentially the government funding a third-party storage solution for grant recipients who are willing to use a third party. Could remove the cost burden from grant recipients and allows the government to get best pricing. And this makes me think of NIH's current STRIDES initiative, where I think for certain OD common fund projects, NIH does cover the cost of the cloud services directly, but otherwise the STRIDES initiative is intended to leverage the collective purchasing power of NIH grant recipients to negotiate for a better price. But the cost burden is still on the individual grant that would like to use those cloud services. And to the point of, you know, a lot of those things often ending at the end of the life of the individual research award. The last time my institution spoke with the STRIDES folks about leveraging that program, the ability to use their reduced costs ends at the end of the award. And so, you know, it's a really great idea, and really, you know, has a lot of potential as a solution. But I think making sure that we're thinking about how we can cover and or reduce the costs associated with this activity over the full life of the project is going to be really important.
That's a good point. Okay, you know, Melissa, before I move to kind of the opening up for any other questions for our prior presenters, are there any kind of closing thoughts? Are there any closing thoughts that any questions anybody has? Melissa, any comments that you want to make on this?
No, I think, you know, it'd be great for us to chat with Michelle about some of these ideas and some of these thoughts afterwards. And I think one of the thoughts we've kicked around is potentially a collaboration between the data stewardship and the finance, audit, and costing groups to perhaps write a white paper and kick the tires on a few ideas, such as the separate award. How would that work? What are the considerations for institutions? And Stephanie just asked me, what are the plans for, or just asked, what are the plans for a future working group in this area? And I think that might be our next step, is to really think about what are the creative solutions that FDP could pitch, and what are all of the considerations, and really think through the full ramifications on both sides, to make sure that we're putting forward some really workable potential solutions, such as, you know, expand the STRIDES initiative, maybe have the government cover those costs directly, maybe make a separate award, and what would that really look like? Put pen to paper and come up with some details.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Stephanie, that's a good point. I think it's a great opportunity for the two committees to collaborate on And again, when we had kind of strategic planning for this year, this was something that Michelle really felt like was important. So, so for all those reasons, I think it's something that we got to continue the conversations on. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide before I thank everybody. So before we shut down a couple of minutes early, any remaining questions for any of the other presenters? If you do, I think you have certainly my the means to contact me, but also I think their email addresses were in their presentations as well. Next slide. So thanks to everybody, Lily and David, as always, for the coordination. Lily was wonderful today as we didn't finish up our PowerPoint until about 20 minutes before the session. So thanks, Lily, but everybody else, Sheila, Rick, Nate, Melissa, Tim, appreciate it. Really great discussion. We will review the chat. We'll review the notes. We'll get all of those out for future discussions. And again, lots of opportunity to join working groups formally or informally, as well as subcommittees and committees. So let me and others know if you have interest in that space. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.